as you remember them. And it's never too early to start writing your stories, but it may be too late. Persons may no longer be here to learn from, or memories may fade. So I thought I'd mention that. My first of three is very brief. It's in this book, When I Was a Kid, and that was put together by Mary Jane Nielsen and Jonathan Roth. And mine is when I was 8 years old and my sister was 6 years old, and it was about a birthday party. The title, Sometimes Love, in quotes, hits you in the face. Birthday parties were big deals in the early 1940s. Farm life meant work, seldom play. When an invitation to Ed's 8th birthday party arrived, we couldn't wait. My sister and I arrived party ready in dresses that Mom had sewn, hair in fat curls. Surprise! All 6 of the other guests were boys. With no apparent party plans, the boys took to chasing us girls. We raced around the windmill behind the pig shed with the boys in close pursuit. Desperately ran into the barn to hide in the hay. That's when the boys discovered eggs. Rotten eggs. They knew what to do. Throw those eggs at the girls. Putrid, rotten eggs globbed in our curled hair, dripped on our party dresses, and yes, even in our faces. We couldn't wait to go home. Mom listened to our story, then explained, sometimes boys chase girls as a way of saying they like you. The second one is game day memories. And it was a little different in those days of how the Cornhusker football games were. This one is the NU Band Day, a memorable experience. On October 17, 1953, I woke up with the Roosters. My Fairbury High School band was invited to perform at the University of Nebraska Band Day that day. I quickly dressed, grabbed my clarinet, and drove to Fairbury. Even though I arrived early, many seats in the chartered buses were taken. I rushed onto one of the buses and popped into a front seat and felt something squish beneath me. I bounced back up and realized that I had just sat on a hat belonging to our band director's wife. How embarrassing! I apologized to Mrs. Faust and then searched for a truly empty seat. The hat incident didn't keep me from being excited about the day ahead. In the 1950s, performing during a University of Nebraska football game was a dream for all the state high school band members. Since 1938, except for cancellations in 1943 and 1944 during World War II, the halftime show has featured musicians performing the length and breadth of the entire football field. Our band arrived in Lincoln, registered by 8 a.m., and then headed to the staging area on 10th Street to line up for the traditional 9:30 a.m. downtown parade. Our Fairbury band uniform stood out with our short military-style jackets trimmed in gold. Our hats featured white plumes. Our trousers were crimson with white stripe. Our drum major and twirlers wore white trousers with a crimson stripe. The rhythm of the drums complemented the rhythm of nearly 200 taps of the metal plates attached to the heels of our white shoes. We marched south from the UNL downtown campus to O Street, marching from 10th to 14th Street on O Street, then back to the stadium. The parade was strictly limited to 1 hour. At the stadium, we joined the other 60-some bands composed of more than 3,000 members to practice for our halftime performance on the main field. We were lucky. Applications from about 50 other bands were turned down because of lack of space. Participation was limited to 3,600 students, the number of seats in the north and south end zone bleachers. These same seats composed the not whole section, except for one game a year for band day. At noon, we enjoyed a lunch served south of the main field provided by the Lincoln Chamber of Commerce. After a fun lunch, we located our seats for the 2 p.m. game and impatiently waited for our halftime performance. Truthfully, it didn't matter to me whom the Nebraska football team played that day. Actually, I don't remember much at all about the game, but I do remember the awesome experience of playing the Star-Spangled Banner with the other 64 bands led by the University Band. My band, along with all the others, created a huge mass band playing as one. Under the direction of Donald A. Lenz, conductor of the NU Band, we also played Hail Varsity, Manhattan Beach, Invercargill, and God Bless America. Our Fairbury twirlers joined with 300 baton twirlers that performed simultaneously along the sidelines as part of the halftime show. They saluted at attention during the national anthem. Of course, I didn't view the football field from the stands, but I can imagine it looked like a giant patchwork quilt. Each band must have stood out in their unique uniforms of varied colors, forming one square of the quilt. Band Day became so popular that it became a 2-year, then a 3-year rotational invitation system to guarantee at least one chance for each student to attend once during high school. The highlight was playing with the University of Nebraska Band and all the other bands on the football field. It was an unbelievable experience to be part of that massive color, emotion, and sound. After the game, I boarded our bus with the other band members. I made sure I found an empty seat before settling in. My mind was filled with thoughts of my long and exhilarating day. What a feeling of satisfaction. That day left me with memories to last a lifetime. And my final one is very brief. And it's a memory of my mother, whose birthday, she's no longer with us, her birthday is in December. And this was part of a devotion that I do each month that's on the website of East Ridge Presbyterian Church. And this one, the reflection is called Hymned with Love. I recall those hot, dry, dirty 30s years growing up on our farm. Year after year, the crops dried up with little left to feed the livestock or to sell. My mom once mused, the only thing we raised those years were our 3 girls. We eagerly looked forward to special times, such as an upcoming family wedding. Since money was very tight, Mom sewed dresses for us girls to wear to the wedding. Mine was fashioned from store-bought blue taffeta trimmed in blue plaid. Mom usually made our dresses from feed sack cotton. Finally, the dresses were finished except for the hemming. It was a good thing because the wedding was the next weekend. Then Mom had a heart attack at age 40. It was a scary time, but Mom was determined that her daughters would attend the wedding in their new dresses. She instructed us to bring the dresses with needle and thread to the hospital. She hemmed the dresses by hand. Our grandparents drove us the 70 miles to the wedding in their old Ford. Each time I heard the swish of my new taffeta dress, I felt a lump in my throat and a special love for Mom. Years later, Mom told me her doctor told her she would never see 50 and to enjoy her family while she could. Mom prayed she would live long enough to raise her girls. My mom died when she was 92 years old after a life of faithful living. I guess we girls took a long time to raise. I am grateful for my mother's love, which reflects God's love.
Lois, those are lovely. Thank you. We have a few minutes, so if you'll indulge me and stay at the podium with me for just a moment. I didn't want to make you nervous ahead of time, so I may not have mentioned that we're live streaming this to the whole world. That doesn't necessarily mean the whole world is watching, but you're fine. You're fine. Go right ahead. But as long as we have a moment, tell me about your recollections of how Lincoln Literacy was in the days when you were the executive director, compared with what you, at least, let's say, perceive it to be like today.
Well, first of all, I started out as a volunteer tutor at Lincoln Literacy and did what many of our tutors do today. And it was a very small organization. When I became the director, they decided that they would pay someone. And it was really, like you say, a full-time job, but it was, you were paid for half-time because that's all they had. And it was not too much. But the thing that's really changed is we had about 50 people that we served when I started. And the 10 years that I was there, we had a big influx. And it had about 500 at the end of the 10 years. So it really grew. The other thing that changed a lot is we had been mostly people that just needed to learn to read that were born in the United States, with a few from other countries, and that flip-flopped by the time I finished. There were many more from other countries that needed help and did it. So
That's certainly the case today. 9 out of 10 of the people we serve are English language learners.
Right. So that's the main thing. We started a family reading parenting program and lots of fun things. It was fun 10 years.
Well, Lois, we have a permanent debt of gratitude to you for the work that you did in growing the organization. I don't think it would be what it is today if you hadn't set us on that course. And we continue to grow, but not quite as fast as what you described. Anyway, thank you very much for coming today and sharing your lovely memoirs.
And I do teach a class at Southeast Community College. The next one is January 10th, just a one session, 9 to noon, on how you can jumpstart writing your stories. And everybody can have fun doing that.
That's great. Well, your students would have a hard time doing it as well as you did, but I'm glad to hear you're still teaching. Thank you. If you've just joined us online, this is the Great Nebraska Read-a-thon. And if you've just come into Indigo Bridge Books, where we're holding it, welcome. We're presenting 9 hours of continuous readings of works by Nebraska writers. And thanks to our volunteer readers, we're still going strong heading into the closing hours. I'd next like to ask a person whose face isn't necessarily going to be familiar to you, but I'll bet his voice will be. Fred Knapp was a newspaper reporter back in the day, but for a number of years now, he's been heard all over the state on our NET radio, our public radio broadcasting system. He reports from the Capitol, as well as covering topical issues. And he's given up a bit of his weekend to come join us today. So, Fred, if you join me here at the podium, as soon as he says his goodbyes, he'll be right here.
Sorry, I'm seeing my homeboy in a while.
All right. Come see us again.
I need that.
Come on here. Fred Knapp, come on up. What are you going to read for us, Fred?
This is an excerpt from one of ours by Willa Cather. It's a story of a Nebraska farm boy who goes off to World War I. And this is as he gets on the troop ship in New York and sails past the Statue of Liberty. It's kind of disorienting here because I'm used to staring into a camera. Hi, everybody. But now we got real people too, so I'll just be like one of those fans and oscillate, okay?
There you are.
All right. It was not easy to cross the deck. Every inch was covered by a boot. The whole superstructure was coated with brown uniforms. They clung to the boat davits, the winches, the railings, and the ventilators. like bees in a swarm. Just as the vessel was backing out, a breeze sprang up and cleared the air. Blue sky broke overhead, and the pale silhouette of buildings on the long island grew sharp and hard. Windows flashed flame-colored in their gray sides. The gold and bronze tops of towers began to gleam where the sunlight struggled through. The transport was sliding down toward the point, and to the left, the eye caught the silver cobweb of bridges seemingly confused against each other. There she is. Hello, old girl. Goodbye, sweetheart. The swarm surged to starboard. They shouted and gesticulated to the image they were all looking for, so much nearer than they had expected to see her, clad in green folds with the mists streaming up like smoke behind. For nearly every one of those 2,500 boys, as for Claude, it was their first glimpse of the Bartholdi statue. Though she was such a definite image in their minds, they had not imagined her in her setting of sea and sky, with the shipping of the world coming and going at her feet, and the moving cloud masses behind her. Postcard pictures had given them no idea of the energy of her large gesture, or how her heaviness becomes among the vaporous elements. France gave her to us, they kept saying, as they saluted her. Before Claude had gotten over his first thrill, the Kansas band in the bow began playing Over There. 2,000 voices took it up, booming out over the water, the gay, indomitable resolution of that jaunty air. A Staten Island ferry boat passed close under the bow of the transport. The passengers were office-going people on their way to work, and when they looked up and saw these hundreds of faces, all young, all bronzed and grinning, they began to shout and wave their handkerchiefs. One of the passengers was an old clergyman, a famous speaker in his day, who went over to the city every morning to write editorials for the church paper. He closed the book he was reading, stood by the rail, and taking off his hat, began solemnly to quote from a poet who in his time was still popular. "Sail on," he quavered. "Thou too, sail on, O ship of state. Humanity, with all its fears, with all its hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate." As the troop ship glided down the sea lane, the old man still watched it from the turtleback. That howling swarm of brown arms and hats and faces looked like nothing but a crowd of American boys going to a football game somewhere. But the scene was ageless. Youths were sailing away to die for an idea, a sentiment, for the mere sound of a phrase. And on their departure, they were making vows to a bronze image in the sea. Thanks. Disappeared. So all that's another thing we do.
Yeah.
When I was growing up in New Jersey, in 9th grade, what? You're from New Jersey too?
No, my books look there for several years.
Oh, yeah?
Livingston.
What ex? Oh yeah.
This is my coworker. Your husband.
All right. His parents lived in New Jersey, so we're bonding here. And what you say when somebody tells you they're from New Jersey, you say, "What accent?" But anyway, in 9th grade, they made us read My Antonia, which is the only Catherine I've ever read, and I couldn't stand it. I mean, it was sort of like chick lit, you know, and nothing happened, and it was Nebraska, and it was all flat. And so I figured, well, I'm never going to spend any time there.
Nebraska.
Yeah. And then about 30 years later, when I was just about moving here, I read the last lines of this excerpt. Well, maybe she did have something to say. So I still haven't read the book, but I like the excerpt.
And that was an excerpt from.
One of ours by Willa Cather.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because I brought something from My Antonia to read.
Oh, that's the one. That's the one.
But, you know,
Maybe
and
I'll
I
like it.
found a passage, but
Oh,
I
yeah.
haven't read the book.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
my
save yourself. Just kidding.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Fred. I really appreciate it. Looks like we have just a few minutes here until our next reader. Are you next? Okay. Let me check the time.
I should go ahead and sit down.
Do you want to read a little something? Let's see, we're at 5:20, we've got 10 more minutes, or I can read a little bit.
You'll read a little.
Yeah, I'll squeeze in a little bit of here. I'm just gonna read a little excerpt from My Antonia by Willa Cather. And I have to say that I love that we are both graduates of the University English Department. Kind of have a little bit of pride in that. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt about wintertime. Winter comes down savagely over a little town on the prairie. The wind that sweeps in from the open country strips away all the leafy screens that hide one yard from another in summer, and the houses seem to draw closer together. The roofs that looked so far away across the green tree tops now stare you in the face, and they are so much uglier than when their angels were softened by vines and shrubs. In the morning, when I was fighting my way to school against the wind, I couldn't see anything but the road in front of me. But in late afternoon, when I was coming home, the town looked bleak and desolate to me. The pale, cold light of winter sunset did not beautify. It was like the light of truth itself. When the smoky clouds hung low in the west and the red sun went down behind them, leaving a pink flush on the snowy roofs and the blue drifts, then the wind sprang up afresh with a kind of bitter song, as if it said, "This is reality, whether you like it or not. All these trivialities of summer, the light and shadow, the living mask of green that trembled over everything, there were lies, and this is what was underneath. This is the truth." It was as if we were being punished for loving the loveliness of summer. If I loitered on the playground after school or went to the post office for the mail and lingered to hear the gossip about the cigar stand, it would be growing dark by the time I came home. The sun was gone. The frozen streets stretched long and blue before me. The lights were shining pale in kitchen windows, and I could smell the suppers cooking as I passed. Few people were abroad, and each one of them was hurrying towards a fire. The glowing stoves in the houses were like magnets. When one passed an old man, one could see nothing of his face but a red nose sticking out between a frosted beard and a long plush cap. The young men capered along with their hands in their pockets and sometimes tried a slide on the icy sidewalk. The children in their bright hoods and comforters never walked but always ran from the moment they left their door, beating their mittens against their sides. When I got as far as the Methodist church, I was about halfway home. I can remember how glad I was when there happened to be a light in the church and the painted glass window shone out at us as we came along the frozen street. In the winter bleakness, a hunger for color came over people, like the Laplanders' craving for fats and sugar. Without knowing why, we used to linger on the sidewalk outside the church when the lamps were lighted early for choir practice or prayer meeting, shivering and talking until our feet were like lumps of ice. The crude reds and greens and blues of that colored glass held us there. Got a little more time. I'll go on. On winter nights, the lights in the Harlings' windows drew me like the painted glass. Inside that warm, roomy house, there was color too. After supper, I used to catch up my cap, stick my hands in my pockets, and dive through the willow hedge as if witches were after me. Of course, Mr. Harling was at home. If his shadow stood out on the blind of the west room, I did not go in, but turned and walked home by the long way through the street, wondering which book I should read as I sat down with the two old people. Such disappointments only gave greater zest to the nights when we acted charades or had costume ball in the back parlor with Sally, always dressed like a boy. Frances taught us to dance that winter, and she said from the first lesson that Antonia would make the best dancer among us. On Saturday nights, Mrs. Harling used to play the old operas for us, Martha, Norma, Rigoletto, telling us the story while she played. Every Saturday night was like a party. The parlor with the back parlor, the dining room were warm and brightly lighted with comfortable chairs and sofas and gay pictures on the walls. One always felt at ease there. Antonia brought her sewing and sat with us. She was already beginning to make pretty clothes for herself. As the long winter evenings on the prairie, with Ambrose's sullen silences and her mother's complaints, the Harlings' house seemed, as she said, like heaven to her. She was never happier chocolate cookies for us. If Sally whispered in her ear or Charlie gave her 3 winks, Tony would rush into the kitchen and build a fire in the range on which she had already cooked 3 meals that day.
Donna, don't leave the podium yet. That's Donna Static, for anybody who doesn't know. Since we're live streaming this to the web, I just want to take a moment and talk with you, because as you read that, it struck me again how lyrical, how rhythmic her writing is, and how plain it is. And yet, to come to be able to do that is something, having grown up here, we just sort of take for granted. For people who've come to America as adults, learning English is so very much more difficult. You work with refugees at Lincoln Literacy. I wonder, having done this for a while now, whether it's changed your view of your own native language in any way.
The way I view or experience English?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it really has. I think it makes me realize how difficult it is to learn English. And sometimes when you're trying to explain, the difference between two and two, or, some of the nuances of English grammar, that it's really difficult to explain, because sometimes it's like, that's just the way it is. And the things you have to just remember it. Yeah. So, but it also makes me appreciate it in a different way. Even though I was an English major, watching people learn to read English is so powerful, and it makes me love the language even more, I think.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I never forget when I was teaching a group of English language learners, one of them stopped me and asked, I understand why I say thank you, you say you're welcome, but why I say thank you, people say you bet. Let me get back to you next week about that.
That's probably specifically regional too.
Yeah, I don't know.
Might be Nebraska.
But for certain, English is a big chaotic language, because so many different people stream together to form it. And we're fortunate that Willa Cather was such a great exponent of it. I hope one day some of our students can read Willa Cather as adults and come to appreciate her. Well, Donna, thank you very much for sharing that excerpt with us. And appreciate the work that you do for Lincoln Literacy.
Thanks.
All right. But we're coming into the final turn of the Great Nebraska Read-a-thon. We have still an hour and a half to go. We started at 10 o'clock this morning, and we've had continuous readings of writings by Nebraska writers. We're here at Indigo Bridge Books, which, like Lincoln Literacy, is a nonprofit organization. Welcome. And we're here mostly to celebrate reading and writing, but also to encourage people to become members of Lincoln Literacy so that we can spread the joy of reading as widely as possible. If you're interested in doing that, you can see our staff member, Sai Moot, here, who will help you become a member. If you'd like just to learn more about what we do, we have some literature on the tables there. Right now, I would like to call to the podium accomplished fellow journalist and now professor of journalism at the University of Nebraska, and also the author of a really moving book. So Joe, if you'd come forward. Joe Starita, I believe at one time worked in Miami in journalism and found his way back to Nebraska, if I'm not mistaken.
That's all true.
Okay.
That's all true.
So far, my reporting record is clean.
You're on your way to a full surprise.
Okay. I better cut it short and leave it good. Joe, thank you for coming today to read from your book, I Am a Man. Tell us a little bit about what the book is about before you read it, please.
Now, am I speaking into?
You are. You're
Okay.
addressing
I'm
the world here
addressing
as well as
cyberspace,
our audience.
But I can take a break every now and then, get in the real world. The backstory here. This is a story about a middle-aged Ponca chief of an obscure tribe living in a remote corner of Nebraska, who forcefully was removed from his beloved homeland with bayonets at his back, even though there were 2 Senate treaties that said this was their homeland, and they had loved their 2 centuries in the Niobrara River Valley. They had grown a deep cultural taproot into the soil. It defined who they were, and it was unimaginable to them that they would be forcibly removed from lands that they had done for more than 200 years. And so when they were told that they were to leave this beloved homeland and go to Oklahoma, but we know that none Nebraskans are going to Oklahoma, not then, not now, not anytime. But they withheld all the food from the people, withheld water from the people, and after 5 days, with people starving and succumbing, the great Ponca chief Standing Bear did what all chiefs do. They sublimate everything for the good of the people. And so they moved to Oklahoma. They didn't know who they were because they didn't know where they were. In 1 year, 1/3 of the tribe had died from malaria, diseases they had nothing to fight against. And Standing Bear, in the last week of his son's life, when he was curled up in a fetal position in a cheap Army canvas tent in north central Oklahoma, and his son, 16-year-old boy named Bearshield, begged his father, "When I die, please do not bury me in this hated soil. Take my body back home." So on January 2nd, 1879, Chief Standing Bear wrapped the body of his only son in a buffalo robe, put him in the back of a rickety wagon, and they began walking in the dead of winter. He and 29 others, 11 men, 10 women, 9 children, began walking in January of 1879 from Oklahoma to the Nebraska-South Dakota border. At that point in time, the United States government had signed 371 treaties with the Native people of America, and they had broken all 371 treaties. But this 52-year-old chief was not going to break his solemn promise to his 16-year-old son that he would bury them in one of the 7 sacred burial grounds along the Niobrara and Missouri rivers. So with little money, little food, little clothing, they began walking in early January 1879 to fulfill that promise. The 3rd day out, a raging blizzard came in from Canada, dropping the wind chill to 77 below zero. They tunneled into haystacks to keep the very old and the very young from freezing. 1 day at a time, 1 week at a time, 1 month at a time, they got within 2 days of the sacred burial grounds, and they were caught by the cavalry. And the cavalry turned them around, marched them back to Fort Omaha, where they were imprisoned. And at that point in time, late April of 1879, a constellation of events began to knit together in Omaha, Nebraska that had never happened before or since. As word of this devoted chief and the pledge that he had made to son got in the papers and people began to read about it, people came out of the woodwork and began to rally around Standing Bear's flag in a way that had never happened in the 103-year history of our country. And that makes it a very powerful, very amazing story. I want to stop there, and I want to just quickly tell you, I'm going to give a little bit of background of the cultural texture of Omaha in the spring of 1879, and then I want to read a very specific section about what happened in the real first civil rights case in American history, in which a Native American looked across the table and saw the highest ranking officer in the United States Army as the defendant in the case, and how this man was able to do something on the 3rd floor of a Yellowstone courthouse in the corner of 15th and Dodge Streets, where there is now a hotel, but in 1879 it was a federal courthouse. And I want to give you the larger lens view of Omaha in 1879, and then stomp down to where we get on the 3rd floor of this courthouse to see what happened at this moment in time, 60 miles from where we sit now. Does that make sense? This is a chapter called The Color of Blood. By the spring of 1879, the United States of America was well on its way to becoming a formidable presence on the world stage. Its divisive, bloody Civil War had ended 14 years earlier. The crippling issue of slavery had technically been resolved, and Thomas Jefferson's vision of an American West filled with productive citizen farmers was an everyday reality. On the East Coast, the captains of industry were energetically transforming the great cities into thriving centers of banking, business, trade, commerce, and manufacturing. Shipyards and fishing fleets bustled. Steel plants and coal mines boomed. Textile mills blossomed. Steamships laden with raw materials ceaselessly prowled a labyrinth of canals and waterways. Across the continent, a sprawling network of iron rails was beginning to bind the vast nation into an increasingly cohesive economy, poised to harvest what seemed like an inexhaustible supply of minerals, timber, cattle, cotton, corn, and wheat. In some instances, the railroad had created communities overnight, communities often filled with ambitious, hungry immigrants and poor farmers staking their claim to a land and a dream they had never imagined. All in all, the United States of America, now just a few months shy of its 103rd birthday, on the verge of flexing its considerable economic, political, and military muscle, was a country in which many of the citizens in its 38 states shared a robust view of the future, a view colored by an unyielding optimism of who they were, and where they were headed. That spring, the fledgling city on the west bank of the Missouri River also claimed a share of the nation's optimistic outlook. For years, a fair number of its 30,000 residents, many with a strong German heritage, had prospered trading with successive waves of immigrants heading west. Now, surrounded by hundreds of miles of some of the best corn-growing, cattle-grazing lands in the world, the Union Pacific Railroad in its backyard, the mighty Missouri on its doorstep, Omaha was emerging as an important rail nexus, stockyard center, and shipping point for a multitude of goods headed to a lucrative eastern market. One package plant alone already was slaughtering more than 60,000 hogs a year. The city, too, boasted some of the finest hotels between Chicago and Denver, its own police and fire departments, 3 daily newspapers, 2 in English and 1 in German, a modern Western Union office, the recently opened Creighton College, and a rich assortment of plays, concerts, and musicals. For much of the decade, it had also maintained a strong frontier flavor, a lawless edge that gave rise to no shortage of whiskey shops, gambling parlors, and brothels. On election day, votes were commonly bought and sold for $1, so it was not unusual to see some of the same citizens moving briskly from one polling place to the next. That spring, the Ponca people also wanted to try and find some answers. They wanted to try and find out who they were in 1879 America, how they were to fit into the nation's own vision of itself, and what the lives of their children and grandchildren might be like in a 1979 America. I'm going to just skip about 20 pages, and with that background of where we were as a country, where Omaha was in the spring of 1879, I want to take the listener, the viewer, the reader to the 3rd floor of this Yellowstone courthouse, where Standing Bear was now on trial. He had sued the government of the United States. It was the final day of the trial, the final hour of the trial, in which his attorney, Andrew Jackson Poppleton, the most powerful attorney in Nebraska in the spring of 1879, who had agreed to represent Standing Bear pro bono, he was now winding down, and the court was rapidly coming to a close. It was well after 9 o'clock. Almost 12 hours since the day's session began. The 3 lawyers had spoken for more than 9 hours, and the large crowd of prominent citizens of clergy and church faithful, judges and lawyers and newsmen, the general's large staff decked in military uniforms, and all their wives milled about after Attorney Poppleton had finished his closing argument, all of them heading for the door. But before the crowd began to file out, the judge made an announcement. Although the trial now had officially ended and the legal proceedings were over, one last speaker, he said, had asked permission to address the court. The judge supposed it was the first time in the nation's history such a request had been made, but he had decided to grant it, and so he had earlier informed all of the lawyers of his intention to do so. The crowd settled back down and turned its attention to the front of the courtroom. They all saw him rise slowly from his seat, and they could see the eagle feather and the braided hair wrapped in otter fur, the blow blue shirt trimmed in red cloth, the blue flannel leggings and deerskin moccasins, the red and blue blanket, the Thomas Jefferson medallion, and the necklace of bear claws. When Standing Bear got to the front, he stopped and faced the audience and extended his right hand, holding it still for a long time. After a while, he turned to the judge, and he began to speak in a low voice. His words conveyed to the judge and the large crowd by the Omaha Indian poet Bright Eyes. That hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If you pierce your hand, you also shall feel pain. The blood that will flow from mine is the same color as yours. I am a man. The same God made us both. Then Standing Bear turned and faced the audience, pausing for a moment, staring in silence out a courtroom window, describing after a time what it was he saw when he looked out that window. I seem to stand on the bank of a river. My wife and little girl are beside me. In front, the river is wide and impassable. Standing Bear sees there are steep cliffs all around. The water is rapidly rising. In desperation, he scans the cliffs and finally spots a steep rocky path to safety. I turn to my wife and child with a shout, "We are saved, we are saved. We will return to the swift running water that pours down between the green islands. There lie the graves of my fathers." So they hurriedly climb the path, getting closer and closer to safety. The water's rushing in behind them. But a man bars the passage. If he says that I cannot pass, then I cannot. The long struggle will have been in vain. My wife and child and I must return and sink beneath the flood. We are weak and faint and sick. I cannot fight no more. Standing Bear stopped and turned, facing the judge, speaking softly. You are that man. In the crowded courtroom, no one spoke or moved for several moments. After a while, a few women could be heard crying in the back. And some of the people up closer could see that the grizzled frontier judge had temporarily lost his composure, and that the general, too, was leaning forward on the table, his hands covering his face. Soon, some people began to clap, and a number of others started cheering, and then the general got up from his chair and went over and shook Standing Bear's hand. And before long, a number of others had done the same. So the bailiffs asked for order, and when it finally grew quiet again, the judge said he would take the case under advisement and issue his decision in a few days. And then he adjourned the court shortly after 10 o'clock on a warm spring evening on the 2nd of May, 1879. So I'll stop there. Yeah. Please.
Joe, thank you so much.
You're welcome so much. I think
Harris.
authors, as a rule, are not nearly as appreciative of their audiences as they should be. So to you out in cyberspace and to you here, I want to say I don't ever want to be guilty of that. So I very much appreciate your invitation, Clay, and very much appreciate all that you're doing and that your staff and your helpers are doing, and keep fighting the good fight.
That's very kind. Thank you. Just read it. Oh, that was absolutely overwhelming. Thank you so very much, Joe. If you're just joining us, this is the Great Nebraska Read-a-thon. We're heading into the final turn in our 9 continuous hours of readings of writing by the writers. We've heard poetry, we've heard children's stories, we've heard history, very dramatic history in that. We've heard some science fiction, and we're not done yet. I'm pleased to be able to introduce somebody that I work with and admire continuously. Carrie Knapp first came to us as a volunteer tutor, and she couldn't get enough of it. One day she came and asked me if I thought that if she volunteered for AmeriCorps, we might accept a year of service from her. And I thought, are you kidding? Would we? We'd be delighted. And she did. She spent a whole year as an AmeriCorps member. And when we was done with that service, we couldn't bear to part with her. So we asked her to stay on and help to coordinate several of our programs, which is what she's doing today when she's not studying. So, Carrie, thank you for being here. What are you going to read for us?
Well, I've chosen a selection from Aldrich's Journey into Christmas. The Best Creature Aldrich is a familiar name among most Nebraskans, and most people will say they haven't read anything by her. But I have read things by her, but I chose this one because it's a nice story about Santa Claus. And
Lovely.
what Santa Claus really is.
Okay, well, the podium is yours.
Santa Claus really is. So it's a bit of a change from the dramatic history we just heard, but this is my story. In those years of the 80s and 90s, Santa Claus was a single entity, an individual upon whom one could count, specifically in regard to time and place. You heard his bells, and he arrived through the side door of a church onto the pulpit, cross-laden and breathless. He bade you farewell and then disappeared through the same door. You heard his bells die away in the distance and knew he was gone for an interminable year. He did not walk the streets advertising toothpaste or barbecued sandwiches or basketball games in the Coliseum, several good seats left at 35 cents. There was one and only one Santa. In that town, he was old Jed Miller. But of course, you did not know that for many years. You went to the church on that night of nights, clothed in several layers of flannels, a dress, a coat, a muffler, knitted hood, mittens, and overshoes. Wedged between equally well-equipped adults, you rode with them in the cutter, your short feet not quite reaching the warm soapstone, your mouth and nose filled with the snow-laden air and buffalo hairs. Even as you turned the corner near the church, you saw the lights shining through the colored glass windows, out over the snow, and in a sickening sensation of fear, you wondered if you missed one moment of the rapture. Although practically nothing could have tempted the fat old mare to budge from the spot, you had to wait while she was tethered to the rail between the hitching posts. When at last, over crunching snow, you went up the steps, your muscles twitching, your mouth dry, almost you were ill in the pit of your stomach. At the doorway, you gazed upon paradise, with a swooning of senses at the sight. Resuscitated after that first shock, they became acute as a bird dog's. For the eyes, there was a great Norway pine sparkling against the white of the wall, packages on and under it, the shiny pipes of the new organ beside it reaching up into heaven. For the ears, rustling of papers or angel wings, it was hard to tell which, and the voices of the congregation singing joy to the world. For the nose, odors of cinnamon and peppermint, fresh popcorn and cooked molasses, crushed balsam and burning wax. In due time, there followed a program to which you did or did not personally contribute, depending largely on the timely question of whether you were in a state of health, or had just passed, or were in the due process of acquiring mumps, measles, chicken pox, whooping cough, or the shingles. But whether or not you donated your services, the pieces spoken were practically all known to you, being largely a repetition of those that had been perpetuated the year before and many years before that. There was the perennial, not a creature was a stirring, not even a mouse, and one which had been handed down from year to year, but which you still had satisfactorily translated, sounding as it did like, lattice in they clabbered, lattice in they say. The program happily over, you saw old Jed Miller go behind the pipe organ again, heard the music of an old hymn, which all would sing, sensed on the verge of a nervous breakdown that after its 7 verses, it was finally dying away into silence, and then A stillness vast and limitless, save for a hysterical giggle or two. This was the moment supreme. This the one toward which all the other moments of all the hours of the year were directed. So vital that the illness came again in the pit of your stomach, and your arms and legs twitched in an ecstasy of emotion. There were bells tinkling faintly and far away, then closer, bringing every tingling hair root to life. Fascinated, you could not take your eyes from the side door, so that when it shook a little, you shook too. He never missed. How could he time himself so definitely to the program's end? The bells jangled now with mad, breathtaking closeness. The door opened. He bounced in merrily, short and rotund, with a round little, you know, the word you ought not to say out loud, that shook like a bowl full of jelly. The children roared their welcome, all but you. You hid your face for a moment because of the world-shaking event that was taking place. He called, "Merry Christmas, children," many times, and said that Pikeville was one of the places he liked best of all to come. He told what a hard time he had getting here, and how the reindeer were stamping outside, impatient for him to hurry. Then he sauntered over to the tree and said, "Well, well, he guessed he'd better begin to call the names on the packages." Thereupon, he handed them out with such intimate comments that it was unbelievable how he could have known so much town gossip. When you went up for yours, he said something so personal that you realized he knew. How uncanny was his knowledge of your everyday life. Sometimes he called the boys by family nicknames, which you scarcely have expected him to know. Tweet, or Tubby, or Babe, so that everyone in the audience laughed. Yes, he knew everyone. "Here's something for Tommy Graham." "Hi, Tommy, what's this I hear again of you hitching your back on the Schmidt's grocery cart? Have you been doing that?" "Yes, sir." "You're not going to be doing that anymore, are you?" "No, sir." The audience roared, and red-eared Tommy received his gift. He knew all, heard all, saw all, the Santa who stalked here en route to other towns. Sometimes when the exercises were nearly over, a swaggering older youth whispered across to you, "Ho, ho, you think that's a real Santa Claus, don't you? Well, it ain't. It's old Jed Miller dressed up." But question, your parents had the retort supreme for you. "Didn't you see old Jed Miller go behind the organ to pump and never come out?" Well, it was true. You admitted the fact of seeing old man Miller disappear into the cavernous depths behind that organ. And because you were unaware that a panel in the sturdy oak wall slipped out of place if one knew where to locate it, you admitted readily enough that Santa Claus came in while old man Miller was still behind there. Sometimes they added still another proof. Wasn't Santa Claus fat? And isn't old man Miller thin as a willow whistle? It silenced you, so that you were convinced for another year, and no poking boy with bragging tongue could shake your faith. The thing that gave you the most confidence in the fabulous wealth and generosity of the little man in red was the fact that when the gifts had all been handed out, he called the boys and girls to the platform. That is, all those who had not reached their 10th birthday. Unbelievably, he gave each one money. 30, 40, 50, even 60 boys and girls. He gave them all a shining quarter. He had done so for years. He had one ruling. Each child must walk up to the tree by himself. No babes in arms and no holding parents' hands. There were those who thought that Pikeville babies learned to walk earlier on account of the Santa Claus order. It was traditional. All the presents were given out. Santa walked to the edge of the platform and held up his hand for silence. The older people in the audience laughed and nudged one another. It's his big moment, and he just lives for it, you might hear, but you didn't understand. Now I want all the boys and girls who can walk up here by themselves and is under 10, everyone to come up again. He patted the big pockets of his scarlet coat and called out in his commanding voice, "I got a little something else for each one of you." The rush to the Klondike then began. Santa Claus held up his hand for silence. I've watched all the children of this here town, and I says to myself, says I, they're pretty good young'uns. I guess I'll give everyone some money.
You're fine.
There was a lusty shouting, so that he held up his hand again. If you were very close, you saw how worn and calloused it was, like a hand that had worked in gardens, and you wondered why. Before I go back to my home, Where do you live? Where do you live? A bold boy perennially asked. Oh, up on yonder in Iceland or Greenland, somewheres in the Arctics. There's 3 things I want you should always remember. Live upright lives. Do some good in the world with this here money I give you. And always keep the Christmas spirit in your hearts. And when you get older, bring all the happiness you can to the other little children at Christmas time. Do you promise? Oh, yes, sir. All right, then. Here goes. Shining quarters, 1 for each child. Again, he knew all about the children. Johnny Quinn, you got your last one a year ago. You were 10 in July. Oh, my goodness, think of him knowing that. You clutched your quarter tightly. It went back to the pew where your parents sat grinning. Look, he gave me money. Well, well, you clutched it all the way home. This different money that came from Iceland or Greenland or the Arctics, but was strangely the same kind of silver money that your parents possessed on rare occasions. If you dropped it on the snow, you bawled to the moon and held up the whole congregation on the steps until it was retrieved. Santa had told you to do good with your money. Sometimes you gave it the very next Sunday to the Sunday school so that you might rid yourself of all further responsibility in the ethics of its disposal. Sometimes after due meditation in which you were torn between moral rectitude and the flesh pots, you sent it to the missionaries via the Ladies' Society with the righteous satisfaction of having converted countless heathens. Sometimes human nature having been quite the same in the not always so gay 90s, you bought huge white gum hearts and licorice with it, waiting conscience smitten for bad luck to follow, immeasurably relieved when it failed to appear. Always the little man ended with that same pronouncement, which he gave like the benediction. Remember, live upright lives. Do something good with your money. Always keep the spirit in your hearts and try to make other children happy.
Okay.
I think we'll stop.
That was lovely. And what a good reader you are.
Well, I've had a lot of practice.
But that must be why we love you at Lincoln Literacy.
I'm always reading Lincoln Literacy.
That's great. Thank you. Carrie Knapp. Really appreciate it. Okay. We are now heading into the final hour of the Great Nebraska Read-a-thon. We have been continuously reading from the works of Nebraska writers. Many of them, as you just heard now, classics. And we've covered pretty much all the genres there are, from children's stories to poetry to history. But now we're going to have a special treat. We have an author, a science fiction author, who's brought his own work to share with us this afternoon. And I'm very pleased to welcome Robert Read to the podium.
Hello.
Robert, thank you very much. Thank you. And you're going to read to us from your latest novel, I understand.
Yeah, The Memory of Sky.
All right, tell us a little bit about it.
It was a bar bet to myself. It was an attempt to write a story where a boy doesn't know anything about his world. And I didn't know anything about his world. And he comes out the door and I had to figure things out as I went. And it had a long history before it got published. And due to many curious reasons, it ended up being 3 books that were going to be published separately. And then Barnes & Noble, which is still kind of large, decided they'd rather have one book.
Yeah.
And so it became one extraordinary value with bookstore, where you can get 3 books in one volume.
I presume you're not going to read all of it in your
I was just going to read the first novel.
Okay, please go right
That's
ahead.
it.
Welcome, Robert Read.
First chapter, the boy was real, and his room was real, but nothing else was. Other rooms and spaces larger than any room stood somewhere beyond the walls, but he couldn't believe in what refused to be seen. He was the one authentic person and the one true life. Even mother and father existed only when they stood beside him, their giant faces covered with silken white masks, gloved hands cradling his tiny misshapen body. They told him that he was a beautiful baby, despite his appearance. They wanted him to relish a long, pleasant life, despite frailties and the endless fever. Their words began as slow, senseless noise, but there was no mistaking the devotion and fear woven into their voices. Learning to love those giants, the boy grieved when they left him, and he wished they could be real even when he was alone. And one day his door was closed and locked, and he let himself imagine his parents standing inside a second room, just like his own, an inspiration, an epiphany, born from his growing love. Then he wasn't a baby anymore. The boy was walking, discovering his own urgent voice and how words were attached to ideas. The first lesson taught to him was that the world was dangerous and often horrible, but he was blessed with a fine, sweet life. Good sons needed to remain behind the door that almost never opened, and regardless how unfair this existence might seem, he was told that those same good sons needed to obey every rule. Disease was the first enemy. Germs rode on the fingers and breath, ready to kill what was weak. Other than his parents, the most frequent visitor was the doctor, a man smaller than his parents, dressed in a white gown and a white mask and thin gloves that stank of disinfectant. The doctor always smiled, even when he was worried. The smile showed in his watchful eyes and musical voice. Every examination began with the question, "How do you feel today, Diamond?" Diamond felt the same every day, but adults never believed that answer, so he claimed he was better here and worse there. The doctor nodded, carefully writing down each lie, and he took his patient's temperature and listened to the malformed heart and slow lungs, and he might measure a hand and short arm, or he would put up a long leg into the air, studying the arched foot and stubby, nearly useless toes. Nothing important would change between visits, but at least the doctor felt certain of that before he gathered up his tools and wished his patient well, locking the great door behind him. Diamond's parents always waited in the hallway, and the boy always jumped off the bed, putting an ear to the heavy wood, listening to three adults using quiet, serious voices. This was how he learned that children born tiny usually died. His modest fever was an old problem, but at least his breathing and pulse didn't seem any worse. And he was managing to grow, though slowly. Sluggish growth was another sure sign of weakness, like his odd skin and the narrow bones. But at least the quarantine was working, and the doctor congratulated his parents for their vigilance. Even the best people sometimes had odd babies, he reminded them. The Creator's hands were at work, and who could say why? Their son was surviving and seemed content enough despite his infirmities. There were fine reasons to celebrate, and if Diamond found strength, he could someday visit other rooms inside the house. And should he become an adult, unlikely as that seemed, he might risk little journeys into the open air, feeding his soul with the beauty and perfection of the world. The boy grew a little older and a little taller, and people came to visit the house, friends and neighbors wanting to wish the old couple well, and if possible, catch a glimpse of their remarkable doomed son. Some spoke about the creators and what was wanted for this boy. Sometimes they stood outside his door, reciting ancient words that might or might not bring blessings to the suffering. The best friends let his parents speak about the burdens and joys that came with sharing their lives with this small, quiet gift of a child. Those good people were likely to meet Diamond if they were free of sniffles and fevers, and if they washed their hands and faces and dressed properly and touched nothing, they were allowed inside his room, if only for a brief visit. One lady was especially nice. Diamond, she said. She always said his name lovingly. "It is so good to see you," she said, her eyes smiling above the mask. "What have you been doing today?" Unlike every other visitor, she acted patient, remaining quiet while the boy named his toys and told their life stories while explaining the various little games that he invented for himself. The woman was younger than his parents, but she had two boys of her own. Diamond never asked about anyone's children. There was still too much baby inside him, and even though he was curious, he couldn't find the best words. But he listened intently when she mentioned her youngest son, how smart and special he was, and once in an offhand fashion, she suggested that the two of them should meet and play games together. That would never happen. But being so young, Diamond accepted his solitude, just like he knew that tomorrow or the next day some horrible illness would find him and his scrawny, weak body would perish. That was the way of the world, and that was the Creator's will, and in the meantime he loved his toys and adored his parents, and each day had its little pleasures and trusted routines. A happy creature by nature, and why should Diamond question any portion of his great little life? One day the young mother came to the house and spoke to the boy for a pleasant while, and then left again. She shut the door, but neglected to lock it, and Diamond sat on the floor and played his soldiers. A hand knocked lightly before trying the heavy brass latch. Then the door swung inward, and a stranger entered. The stranger didn't wear any mask or gloves, and for that matter, any kind of smile. He was the lady's older son, a very big boy, pulled into the room by curiosity. Saying nothing, he watched the toddler set down the block and the wooden soldier, and then stand up, remaining where he was. The large boy studied Diamond's ugly long legs and the long-shaped face with the tiny nose and those odd pale eyes, and the teeth that were too white to be real. "Hello," Diamond said. With a dismissive sneer, the stranger said, "You don't sound right either." The boy decided to say nothing. You aren't sick," the stranger said. "That's just a story, isn't it? I know what you really are. You're some kind of monster." Diamond shifted his weight from one leg to the other, wishing this person would leave. Then the stranger came close, and when Diamond backed away, the big boy said, "No, stay where you are. I mean it." The boy's voice was angry and it was happy. He sounded both ways at once, unlikely as it might seem. And he was smiling now, except it wasn't a normal smile. "Guess what I'm going to do," the stranger said. "Guess." Diamond said nothing and did nothing. "All right, I'll show you." Then he reached into a pocket right in his trouser leg, pulling out a long, bright knife. And he drove the knife into Diamond's belly, watching the tiny boy squirm and bleed, using a quiet, happy voice, and he told him, "That's what you do with monsters. You kill them." After that day, people were forbidden to see Diamond, and very few friends visited the house anymore. The only other guest was the doctor, but there were fewer examinations after the stabbing. The boy didn't seem to require the same exhaustive care, and the doctor used a new voice with the parents, hard and skeptical and sometimes loud. There was no good explanation for these phenomena, he warned. He was doing quite a lot of research, and certain old writings mentioned strange births and ancient children displaying the occasional odd power, but he doubted that his patient was like anyone ever born before. One day, the doctor demanded to be left alone with his patient. That final examination lasted a long while. Little knives and steel hooks were involved, as well as gruff warnings to be quiet, and the test might have continued all day if Father hadn't come through the door. Stepping away from the bed, the doctor pulled off one of his gloves. "What are you doing?" Father asked. What I should have done hundreds of days ago," said the doctor. Then he put the surgical tools back into their case, and in front of Diamond, he warned that disease might eventually kill the boy, but that wasn't the worst problem. What the parents needed to fear, honestly and with all their heart, were the mysteries wrapped around the creature living in their midst. Mother stood beside Father now, her hands wrestling with one another. "Are you all right?" she asked Diamond. "I'm fine," he said, sitting up, showing the marks that weren't even wounds anymore. Then the doctor said, I've asked before, but maybe this time you'll convince me. Was the pregnancy normal?" Mother muttered a few soft words. Turning toward Father, the doctor said, "I want to examine your wife. A careful, thorough assessment would only help." Father stepped forward, towering over the doctor, and with a voice louder than Diamond had ever heard, he told the little man, "We've seen enough and heard enough from you, sir. Before I knock you on your ass, leave. Climb away and don't come back. And if you talk about this to anyone, I'll gut you. I will gut you while you live, which is what you deserve, believe me." Thank you. He heals quickly. That's one of his aspects. He's also a little brighter than most people. And he isn't a lead. Other than that, what I did is I blended together a bunch of other people's stories, including Superman and Tarzan and so on and so forth. And I made a young adult novel.
Uh-huh.
That was the first attempt. The first book is like that. And it didn't get bought that way. And then I got bored with that premise and I saw options. So the second book becomes far grimmer than this, believe it or not.
Well, there's a precedent for that. It sort of happens with the Harry Potter stories as well.
They get grimmer.
Yeah, they do.
There are only three movies into the series, and I've never read the book. So that's it.
Anyway, before you go, I'm just curious to know. Most writers all writers start out as readers, but in particular, reading is often an important part of their childhood. Was that the case for you? Did you read a lot as a kid?
Later, I read maybe a bit later than some in terms of being exhausted, an endless reader, and I read science fiction much later than maybe I should. Because most writers who science fiction writers read when they're 12 everything. And I read more like when I was 17 in college, 17 and 18 when I was in college. I started to read a lot of science fiction, which kind of changes the way I look at the story.
What first grabbed you in science fiction?
There was a series of collections of Nebula Awards are given to the best science fiction writers decide who's the best with the best stories. And these were the old ones. These were the ones before they introduced the nebulas in the middle 60s, 1960s. So there were several collections, and I read those. They were short stories and novellas, which also has always been my favorite area of writing. They're commercial reasons.
Okay.
And frankly, I enjoy this too. But most of my production has been almost 300 stories. So that's where most of the work is. But that's what I read first. Those kind of old-fashioned. But I was doing it with 17-year-old eyes or 18-year-old eyes, which is a different sport.
That's certainly true. Well, we're delighted you came here today to share some of your work in memory of Sky.
Okay.
And it's good to have you as part of the great Nebraska
It was a
Read-a-thon.
pleasure to be invited. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Robert. It's really good to have you. Okay, so we're in the final hour. The minutes are ticking away. The great Nebraska Read-a-thon is approaching its end, but we've still got some good stuff to share with you. And we've got some great people to help do that. The person that I'll be introducing next is somebody who I have a deep affection and admiration for because she's done so much to help others through Lincoln Literacy. Long before I was executive director of Lincoln Literacy, Marlene Perkins was already a volunteer tutor there. She was instrumental in the creation of our first major program for Sudanese refugees. She continues to serve even now on the board of directors, and she's just been a great inspiration to the organization and somebody who's never afraid to ask tough questions of me, which you laugh, but you don't know how much I appreciate that. There's nothing worse for a nonprofit organization than an apathetic board, and Marlene certainly sets a good example of the right kind of board member to have. So Marlene Perkins, please come join me here at the podium. So what are you going to share with us?
I'm going to read from Rainbow Rowell's book, Landline.
Oh, okay.
She is from Omaha. She lives in Omaha with her husband and her 2 sons. And she went to UNL. She graduated probably in about 1994. She wrote for the Daily Nebraskan. She wrote a column for the World Herald. And she currently is working on a screenplay for Eleanor and Clark, a book that she wrote. And it's going to be, hopefully it'll be a movie here. I think that's it.
Okay, well, Marlene, the podium is yours. Look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
I think the one thing you need to know about her books, I've only read 2 of them, but most of them are in dialogue. So listening to me may be a little difficult to know who's speaking because she doesn't say, she writes a dialogue. But I want to read the beginning of the synopsis of this book. The name of the book is Landline. And it starts out, Georgie McCool knows her marriage is in trouble. That it's been in trouble for a long time. She still loves her husband, Neil, and Neil still loves her deeply. But that almost seems beside the point now. Maybe that was always beside the point. 2 days before they're supposed to visit Neil's family in Omaha for Christmas, Georgie tells Neil that she can't go. She's a TV writer and that something's come up on her show. She has to stay in Los Angeles. She knows that Neil will be upset with her. Neil is always a little upset with Georgie, but she doesn't expect him to pack up the kids and go to Omaha without her. When her husband and the kids leave for the airport, Georgie wonders if she's finally done it, if she's ruined everything. That night, Georgie discovers a way to communicate with Neil in the past. It's not time travel, not exactly, but she feels like she's been given an opportunity to fix her marriage before it starts. Is that what she's supposed to do? Or would Georgie and Neil be better off if their marriage never happened? Looking through the book, I had a hard time, and I decided the best way to read from this book would be to start at the beginning. So I'm going to read from chapter 1, and you'll get an idea about how she starts the story. Georgie pulled into the driveway, swerving to miss a bike. Neil never made Alice put it away. Apparently, bicycles never got stolen back in Nebraska, and people never tried to break into your house. Neil didn't even lock the front door most nights until Georgie came home, though she told him that was like putting the sign in the yard that said, "Please rob us at gunpoint." No, he said, that would be different, I think. She hauled the bike up onto the porch and opened the unlocked door. The lights were off in the living room, but the TV was still on. Alice had fallen asleep on the couch watching Pink Panther cartoons. Georgie went to turn it off and stumbled over a bowl of milk sitting on the floor. There was a stack of laundry folded up on the coffee table. She grabbed whatever was on the top to wipe up the milk. When Neil stepped into the archway between the living room and the dining room, Georgie was crouched on the floor, sopping up milk with a pair of her own underwear. Sorry, he said, Alice wanted to put milk out for Numi. It's okay. I wasn't paying attention. Georgie stood up, wadding the wet underwear in her fist. She nodded at Alice. Is she feeling okay? Neil reached out and took the underwear, then picked up the bowl. She's fine. I told her she could wait up for you. It was this whole negotiation over eating her tail and not using the word literally anymore, because it's literally driving me crazy. He looked back at Georgie on his way to the kitchen. You hungry? Yeah, she said, following him. Neil was in a good mood tonight. Usually when Georgie got home this late, he wasn't in a good mood. She sat at the breakfast bar, clearing the space with her elbows among the bills and library books and second-grade worksheets. Neil walked to the stove and turned on a burner. He was wearing pajama pants and a white t-shirt, and he looked like he'd just gotten a haircut, probably for their trip. If Georgie touched the back of his head now, it'd feel like velvet one way and Neil's the other. I wasn't sure what you wanted to pack, he said, but I washed everything in your hamper. Don't forget that it's cold there. You always forget that it's cold. I always ended up stealing Neil's sweaters. He was in such a good mood tonight. He smiled as he made up her plate. Stir-fry, salmon, kale, other green things. He crushed a handful of cashews in his fist and sprinkled them on top, then set the plate in front of her. When Neil smiled, he had dimples like parentheses, stubbly parentheses. Georgie wanted to pull him over to the breakfast bar and nose at his cheeks. That was her standard response to Neil smiling, though Neil probably wouldn't know that. I think I washed all your jeans, he said, pouring her a glass of wine. Georgie took a deep breath. She just had to get this over with. I got good news today. He leaned back against the counter and raised an eyebrow. Yeah? Yeah, so Maher Jafari wants our show. What's a Maher Jafari? Well, he's the network guy we've been talking to, the one who greenlit The Lobby and that new reality show about tobacco farmers. Right, the network guy. I thought he was giving you the cold shoulder. We thought he was giving us the cold shoulder, Georgie said. Apparently, he just had cold shoulders. Wow, that is really good news. So he cocked his head to the side. Why don't you seem happy? I'm thrilled, Georgie said. Trilly. She was probably sweating. He wants a pilot scripts. We've got a big meeting to talk casting. That's great, Neil said, waving. He knew she was burying the lead. Georgie closed her eyes. On the 27th. The kitchen was quiet. She opened them. There was Neil she knew and loved. The folded arms, the narrowed eyes, the knots of muscle in both corners of his jaw. We're going to be in Omaha on the 27th, he said. I know, she said. Neil, I know. So are you planning to fly back to LA early? No, we have to get the scripts ready before then. Seth, all we've got done is the pilot, Georgie said. We've got 9 days to write 4 episodes and get ready for the meeting. It's really lucky that we have some time off from jacked up this week. You have time off because it's Christmas. I know that it's Christmas, Neil. I'm not skipping Christmas. You're not? No, just skipping Omaha. I thought we could all skip Omaha. We already have plane tickets. Neil, it's a pilot, a deal with our dream network. Georgie felt like she was reading from the book. She'd already had this entire conversation, almost verbatim, this afternoon itself. It's Christmas, she'd argued. They were in their office, Seth was sitting on Georgie's side of the big L-shaped desk they shared. He'd had her cornered. Come on, Georgie, we still have Christmas. We'll have the best Christmas ever after the meeting. Tell that to my kids. I will. Your kids love me. Seth, it's Christmas. Can't this meeting wait? We've already been waiting our whole career. This is happening, Georgie. Now, it's finally happening. Seth wouldn't stop saying her name. Neil's nostrils were flaring. My mom's expecting us, he said. I know, Georgie whispered. And the kids, Alice sent Santa Claus a change of address card so he'd know she was in Omaha. Georgie tried to smile. It was a weak effort. I think he'll figure it out. That's not. Neil shoved the corkscrew in the door, then slammed it shut. His voice dropped. That's not the point. I know, she leaned over her plate, but we can go to see your mom next month and take Alice out of school if we have to. Neil had both hands on the counter, clenching the muscles in his forearms, like he was retroactively bracing himself for bad news. His head was hanging down, and his hair fell away from his forehead. This might be our shot, Georgie said, our own show. Neil nodded without lifting his head. Right, he said. His voice was soft and flat. Georgie waited. Sometimes she lost her place when she was arguing with Neil. The argument would shift into something else, into something more dangerous, and Georgie wouldn't even realize it. Sometimes Neil would end the conversation or abandon it while she was still making her point, and she'd just go on arguing long after he checked out. Georgie wasn't sure whether this even qualified as an argument yet, so she was waiting. Neil hung his head. What does right mean? She finally said. He pushed off the counter. All their arms and square shoulders means that you're right, obviously. He started clearing the stove. You have to go to this meeting. It's important. He said it almost lightly. Maybe everything was going to be fine after all. Maybe he'd even be excited for her eventually. So, she said, testing the air between them. We'll see about visiting your mom next month. Neil opened the dishwasher and started gathering up dishes. No, Georgie pressed her lips together. You don't want to take Alice out of school? He shook his head. She watched him load the dishwasher. This summer then? His head jerked slightly, like something had brushed his ear. Neil had lovely ears, a little too big, and they poked out at the top of like wings. Georgie liked to hold his head by his ears when he left her. She could imagine his head in her hands now, could feel her thumbs stroking the tops of his ears, her knuckles brushing against his flickered hair. No, he said again, standing up straight and wiping his palms on his beautiful pants. We've already got plane tickets. Neil, I'm serious. I can't miss this meeting. I know, he said, turning toward him. His jaw was set, permanently. Back in college, Neil had thought about joining the military. He would have been really good at that part where you have to deliver terrible news or execute a heartbreaking order without betraying how much it was costing you. Neil's face could fly and Enola Gay. I don't understand, Georgie said. You can't miss this meeting, he said, and we already have plane tickets. You'll be working all week anyway, so you stay here, focus on your show, and we'll go see my mom. But it's Christmas, the kids. They can have Christmas again with you when we get back. They'll love that. 2 Christmases. Georgie wasn't sure how to react. Maybe if Neil had been smiling when he said that last thing. He motioned at her plate. Do you want me to heat that back up for you? It's fine, she said. He nodded his head minimally, then brushed past her, leaning over just enough to touch his lips to her cheek. Then he was in the living room, lifting Alice up off the couch. Georgie could hear him shushing her. It's okay, sweetie. I've got you. And he started climbing the stairs. And that's a good book. And they do get on.
Okay. Thank you. You were reading from Rainbow Roll's Landlines.
Yes.
Well, one more thing that you've done for us that I didn't mention earlier was you got Rainbow Roll to come and be our speaker a couple of years back when she had written an earlier novel.
It's called Attachments.
Attachments, that's right.
And that was about a computer.
Well, Marlene, before you leave us, just if I could ask you for a moment, what has kept you engaged with Lincoln Literacy for these many years? Many of our tutors volunteer for a year or more, but you've really gone the extra mile and the extra decade.
Let's see. Well, I was a school teacher for nearly 40 years, and I was a speech therapist, and I taught children up through high school, I guess.
Oh, they are. They are.
And when I retired, it was hard to know just exactly what to do. I thought it would be interesting to change over from children to adults. And I happened to see an article it was the neighborhood extra, and said that they needed tutors, and decided. I think mainly I grew up believing in outreach and working in the community, and
Well, we're very grateful that you have, and really appreciate you coming back here this afternoon to share that lovely reading. Thank you, Marlene Perkins. All right, the Great Nebraska Read-a-thon is approaching its final moments. There are just 2 readers left, and you'll particularly want to hear the next one because the final one is me, and you've already heard plenty from me. But at this time, it's a great pleasure to call forward to the podium somebody who's, as much as anyone, made this day possible. Aisha Martin is the manager of Indigo Bridge Books, and here she is. And when we first conceived of this idea, in general, we immediately thought of Indigo Bridge Books as the natural home for it because we're a nonprofit organization, you're a nonprofit organization, we love books, you love books, but also exceptionally for a bookstore, you really do a lot of community outreach and a lot of community service. So thank you for hosting us, but thank you as well for everything else that you do.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you for having me read.
All right, so what are you going to have for us, Aisha?
I have a work of fiction by Joy Castro. It's the first in a series. It's called Hell or High Water. She is an author, but she's also a UNL professor. She's a great writer, and it's a mystery, but a mystery with some cause behind it. So it kind of is quite a good fit for us. I hope to intrigue people with it.
Okay, well the podium is yours. Thank you.
I read books a lot for a living, but not out loud normally, so. Cecily could find her way to the bathroom perfectly well by herself. Thank you very much. She might have been only 7, but she could tie shoes, climb trees like a boy, and ride bikes to the leafy streets of their neighborhood back home in Lawrence. She didn't need any big sister escorting her to the ladies' room. She scowled at her father, who relented, shrugging. So go then, said Sophie, the superfluous big sister, who was 11. Quivering with insult, Cecily pushed down from the table and strode off across the restaurant. Sophie watched her go. Cecily's soft brown hair was cut in a bob of bangs, something simple their father could manage. But Sophie could take care of herself. She could braid her own hair, or put it up in a swinging ponytail, or twist it into a neat low bun like their mother used to wear when the girls were small. Goodbye to vanity, their mother would laugh on the phone to her friends. But she stayed vain, even at the end, in the hospital, carefully penciling a fresh pink mouth over her own before they arrived, holding hands and standing hushed beside the bed. Their cardigans buttoned all lopsided, their breasts crooked, while their father stroked her hand and spoke in a low, strained voice. Once, she had forgotten to put it on, and Sophie had worked hard not to stare at her pale, cracked lips, but not hard enough, because their mother had put her hand up to her mouth and said, "Oh." Now they had visitors from time to time, nice women who appeared at breakfast and were introduced by their father as my promising student. One of them, Amber Waybridge, had come along to New Orleans with them. As an au pair, their father said. Amber was 25, an MFA student, which her father usually called a dime a dozen, but he didn't say that about Amber. It wasn't just a vacation for fun. His father was there for inspiration because his work was suffering. He couldn't seem to produce the kind of sculptures that had made his reputation, the kind that kept Sophie disgusted away from his studio. Single masculine legs standing on the floor with their big things jutting out or hanging down, all painted in swirling bright reds and greens and blues and blacks, with splashes of silver and gold, so that you could hardly tell what they were. But Sophie knew and thought they were gross. Since their mother's death, all his pieces were just the color of plaster, a color like sawdust or putty. Sophie thought the new sculptures were even more gross, but Cecily didn't mind. She was quick and happy in general. She'd adjusted well, their father would murmur confidentially to adults, and ran around his studio laughing. Sophie thought she laughed an awful lot. Sometimes it seemed like she didn't even remember their mother. Don't believe, their mother would have said. Daddy won't like it. His next show, Surrealisms of the Body, was already scheduled for the University Gallery's fall calendar, and Sophie knew he was counting on New Orleans to recharge him. He was on spring break, as was Amber Waybridge, and he'd taken the girls out of school for the week. They had been to numerous galleries as well as out in a flat-bottomed boat for an alligator tour of the bayous, where tall white waterbirds flapped in flight at their approach. When the guide cut the motor and tossed marshmallows onto the slick, shining brown skin of the water, they all sat silently on the metal benches, squeezed among the other tourists. The horrific green foliage and the insect's wine seemed to close in upon them. Hands inside the boat, the guide had barked suddenly into his microphone, and long muscled bodies had slid alongside them and risen up. The scaly, pale flesh, the lizardy eye, vast jaws had opened and snapped. "Daddy!" Cecily had screamed, but it was Sophie's arm she grabbed. That had been Saturday. Now it was Monday, and they were getting a fresh start with breakfast at the Copper Pot, a cheerful restaurant with waitresses who joked and grinned when they took the order. The walls were a bright warm yellow, and the fronds of potted palm trees nodded in the ceiling fan's breeze. It felt tropical, so different from the long gray Kansas winter. At the table, her father sifted through maps and tourist guides while Amber leafed through the Times County. Second body found blared a headline so large Sophie could read it upside down. The father had explained that New Orleans was one of the murder capitals of America and given them lengthy instructions about safety and the buddy system and always staying close to him or Amber Waybridge, though Sophie would never willingly get close to Amber Waybridge, who kept pausing to lift her tanned wrist, tilting it in the light to admire the new bracelet her father had bought her. A slender gold chain studded with tiny diamonds, for watching the girls, he'd said loudly, as if Sophie were stupid. Sophie ran her fingertip across the elaborate castle, all purple turrets and red spires, that Cecily had been crammed into a sketch pad. No electronica on vacation, their father had said firmly, but Sophie had heard, under his dictatorial tone, the plea, almost a whine, and she knew that with a little pressure he could be overcome, that he secretly longed to continue the quiet, familiar isolation of all of them absorbed in their Game Boys and iPods and iPhones and laptops, their bodies moving along together but their minds in separate worlds, the way they had been ever since the pancreatic began. Sophie knew she would have to complain only a little for their father to give in, to collapse and let them retreat into their unshareable distractions. So she said nothing. She wanted more. She wanted a real vacation, the kind they'd had with Mommy at Yosemite, when the girls wore matching headscarves and Daddy carried their supplies in a backpack. Their mother never let the girls wear the kinds of shirts Amber Waybridge wore, black t-shirts cropped short to show her smooth belly. When would the food come? Sophie sipped her grapefruit juice, pressing her lips close together to keep the pulpy bits out. With her fingernail, she picked at the corner of the laminated map Daddy was studying, peeling the plastic back from its edge. "Stop that," Daddy said, writing in his tiny notebook. He was plotting their day. The French Quarter had plenty of galleries they hadn't looked at yet, and the Cabildo was full of historical things, including things from slavery days that he'd said he wasn't sure the children were old enough to see. They'd already broke through the dark historical dioramas of the UC County Maps Museum and hurried down Bourbon Street, their father muttering, "Well, this was a mistake," and ignoring their questions about why anyone would want to wrestle in them. While Amber David left in her hands, black ball of the compass that was built right into the map, pushing the inn all the way around, then letting it spring back. North to be south of you, just kept pushing. "Where's your sister?" Daddy said. She looked up. It had been a while. Maybe Cecily was making number two. She always picked the most awkward times to do it, instead of just waiting until they got back to the hotel. "Go check on her," he said. Sophie rolled her eyes, sighing loudly. "I'll go," said Amber Waybridge, quickly, smiling, laying her hand on his arm. She pushed back from the table and set off. Sophie knew the word for her, ingratiating. and it seemed to be working on their father, who smiled briefly, watching Amber Waybridge walk away. He liked to talk about how new and bold her work was. On the strength of his recommendation, she had won a summer's artist residency in Vermont. Sylvie couldn't wait for her to leave. Just as the eggs and toast and bacon arrived, Cecily clambered back to the table and climbed into her chair. Her small purple tennis shoes swinging. "Where have you been?" Sophie said in annoyance, not expecting an answer, and not receiving one. Bright wedges of orange rimmed the plates. Good. Pour for Father Crown. Wait for Amber. "Where is old Amber anyway?" asked Cecily, already biting into an orange. The father looked at her. "She was with you." Cecily shook her head and spoke with her mouth full. "Uh-uh. She went to the ladies' room to find you." "I didn't see her." The father sighed heavily. "Soph, would you go see what's keeping her?" Sophie sighed in return, sliding slowly from her chair, her every exaggerated motion of protest. It felt good to skid her rubber toes across the tile. She rounded the corner into a long corridor paneled with dark wood and lit by a single dim sconce. The floor was dark cement and doors flanked her on both sides, closed doors with faded gold-painted letters that said private and employees only and exit, and doorways branching into other hallways, narrow and dark. A veritable warren, her mother would have called it. No wonder it had taken Cecily so long. Near the end of the corridor, Sophie pushed open the glossy black door to the ladies' room. "Amber?" Sophie bent and peered under the doors, but saw no tan ankles, no strappy sandals, no toe ring. "The food's there already," she said, pushing open one middle door after another, but her voice echoed and all the stalls were empty, and she knew she was alone. In the wide cupboard under the sinks, there was only big white wheels of toilet paper. Annoyed, Sophie headed back down the dark corridor, trailing her fingers along the paneled wood. When the kitchen door flashed open and the waiter hurried out, a swath of fluorescent light, lit the hallway for an instant, and the whole corridor flashed into brilliant relief. In a sudden illumination, Sophie could see a curl of lemon rind on the dark cement, and the sticky spots of moth mist. And there, on the floor near the door-marked exit, lay a small and broken gold chain, its tiny diamonds glittering. Then things got very loud and frantic, with Daddy shouting for the waiter, then the manager, and running with the employees to push doors open with a loud, fast slam. Not just the ladies' room, but the men's room, the storage rooms, the walk-in, the kitchen, where all the cooks peered curiously, their knives stilled in mid-chop. All the other diners were on their feet, looking, saying what they'd seen, who'd left the restaurant, a woman with blonde hair, a man with a big duffel bag, 3 large college boys who looked hungover, but no pretty 25-year-old with dark hair and a cropped black t-shirt. When the police came, Daddy was out on the sidewalk, yelling, and the people said it all again, and Sophie told her story to a big officer who nodded and blinked. Their father yelled, "Stay there, right there," at Sophie, and so she stood next to the restaurant manager, gripping Cecily's hand, while her father and the police searched everywhere again, the whole building and the street outside, the alleys and the shop next door. But Amber Waybridge wasn't there. She wasn't anywhere. That's the end of the intro.
Asia, thank you very much. And again, that was Hell or High Water by Joy Castro. Yeah, for those of you who are watching online, we are coming to the very end of our 9-hour Great Nebraska Read-a-thon. And I want to say a real special thank you to you and to the Colemans, the owners of Indigo, or the founders of Indigo Bridge Books. It's been wonderful to be here for the day.
I enjoyed having you.
Well, we really very much appreciate it. Thank you, Asia Mark. And now, for the final reading this evening, I don't need any notes to introduce our reader because it's me. I know myself fairly well, but I do need actually my text, which I left behind. Thank you. Before I share this last reading, and my hope is that my voice is big enough to even carry over the espresso machine, but we'll see. I just want to say a word or two. You know, I was one of those kids who spent more time reading than playing, and so perhaps that's warped my view of life. But I'm not only the executive director of Lincoln Literacy, a job I truly love and give a lot of my time and effort to, but I'm also a writer, a science writer in particular. And so from the perspective of a science writer, I want to say that I truly think that writing is the single most important technology that humankind has ever invented. Of all the things that make us a really extraordinary species on this earth, I think writing is the single most important thing that we've ever done because it allows us to communicate across times and to accumulate ideas, to reflect critically on what we say to one another. And in some sense, although television is a great advance. It's also, in some sense, a setback because it means that people spend a lot more time listening to angry talking heads on the media than they do perhaps reading reflectively. But there is still great value to the written word, I believe. And I think as long as civilization lasts, it will be central to civilization. So with those thoughts as a preamble, I want to say that I think what Lincoln Literacy does is so important to our community that I am in awe of the more than 300 people who volunteer their time as Lincoln Literacy tutors. For me, I'm fortunate enough to have a job as the executive director of Lincoln Literacy. But if not for those volunteer tutors, my job wouldn't be worth a nickel. Nothing that we do would be worthwhile if not for the people who are willing to give their time and effort to help others. So I just want to pause and note my gratitude to them, as well as to the staff of Lincoln Literacy. It's a small staff, and most of the people who work there do so out of a real love of what we do. They certainly don't do it to get wealthy, but their work makes it possible for the tutors to do their jobs as well. So with that, I want to introduce this final reading in a long day of reading. And I'm happy to say that I've chosen somebody who should be represented in this day, but hasn't so far been. Ted Sorensen, a great Nebraskan who wrote speeches for President John F. Kennedy. So the words that I'm going to share with you are highlights from two speeches. They were spoken by President John F. Kennedy, but they were written by Ted Sorensen. And as I chose them, I reflected that both have a dual quality to them. On the one hand, they show that some of the things that America was struggling with or aspiring to in the early 1960s are things that we're still struggling with or aspiring to today. But by the same token, as you listen to these two speeches, I think you'll realize how tremendously far we've come in the decades since. This first one is a televised speech that President Kennedy gave in June 1963 as the federal troops had to be called out to restore order at the University of Alabama after two African-American men were admitted as students. Tremendous riots broke out. There were deadly shootings. And so President Kennedy took to the airwaves to address the nation. And this is some of what he said, again, in Ted Sorensen's words. Good evening, my fellow citizens. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today, we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants, and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children would be treated. But this is not the case. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scripture and as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public schools available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free except for the Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens except Negroes? That we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes? Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south, where legal remedies are not at hand. Redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and as a people. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality. In this respect, I want to pay tribute to those citizens north and south who have been working in their communities to make life better for all. They are acting not out of a sense of legal duty, but out of a sense of human decency. This is one country. It has become one country because all of us and all the people who came here had an equal chance to develop their talents. We cannot say to 10% of the population that you can't have that right, that your children can't have the chance to develop whatever talents they have, that the only way they are going to get their rights is to go into the streets and demonstrate. I think we owe them and we owe ourselves a better country than that. Therefore, I am asking for your help in making it easier for us to move ahead and to provide the kind of equality of treatment which we would want ourselves, to give a chance for every child to be educated to the limits of his talents. Those are the ringing words of Ted Sorensen, which he wrote for President John F. Kennedy in 1963, when legal segregation was just beginning to crack. And as you listen to them, you can't help but reflect that on the one hand, yes, we have ended legal segregation, and we have come an awful long way in fulfilling the promise of opportunity for everybody. On the other hand, we still have deep social divisions and deep social problems that are manifested in our society today. I'm going to move on to one other speech, and this one has both literally and figuratively a more uplifting tone. It's the speech that President John F. Kennedy gave at Rice University when he declared it's our national goal to send a man to the moon. And incidentally, as I say that we've come a long way, one of the ways that we've come forward a great deal is that all of the pronouns in these speeches are masculine. And there's no reference at all or no thought at all to the role of women in all of this. And thank heavens we've changed greatly since then. And today, nobody, I hope, would write a speech that was exclusively masculine. So this is President Kennedy's speech delivered at Rice University on September 12, 1962, and written by Ted Sorensen. We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. Despite the striking fact that most of the scientists that the world has ever known are alive and working today, that vast stretches of the unknown, unanswered and unfinished, still far outstrip our collective comprehension. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come, but condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except that at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover themselves. Then, about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his cave to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and to use a cart with wheels. Only 2 years ago, Christianity began. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. And now, if America's new spacecraft succeeds in reaching Venice, we will have reached literally the stars before midnight tonight. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels the old. New ignorance, new problems, new dangers. Surely, the opening of vistas of space promises high costs and hardship, as well as high reward. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man, in his quest for knowledge and progress, is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of our time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in the race for space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding. We set sail on this new sea because there's new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. We have had our failures, but so have others, even if they do not admit to them. To be sure, we are behind and will stay behind for some time in manned flight. But we do not intend to stay behind, and in this decade, we shall make up and move ahead. To be sure, all this costs a good deal of money. This year's space budget is 3 times what it was in January 1961, and it is greater than the space budget of the previous 8 years combined. That budget now stands at a staggering sum, though somewhat less than we pay for cigarettes and cigars each year. We have given this program a high national priority, even though I realize that this is in some measure an act of faith and vision, for we do not know what benefits await us. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket, more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles an hour, causing heat about half that of the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today. and do all this and do it right and do it before the decade is out, then we must be bold. Magnificent words written by Ted Sorensen, the late Ted Sorensen of Nebraska, many decades ago, and then read by President John F. Kennedy. And I said at the outset that these speeches resonate with the present moment. We just tested the Orion rocket, NASA's latest venture, which we hope will carry us not just to the moon, but beyond. Well, with that uplifting note, I want to bring to close the Great Nebraska Read-a-thon and thank everybody who's come out to read today, everybody who's come out to help support the event, and our hosts here at Indigo Bridge Books once again. As I said at the outset, this was a celebration of reading and writing, but also an opportunity to support Lincoln Literacy. If you're watching us online, you can do that by becoming a member of Lincoln Literacy. Just follow the links to lincolnliteracy.org and you'll see that. If you care to become a member here today, we still have some coupons good for ice cream at Iconic Cone. With that, I declare the Great Nebraska Read-a-thon at an end. Thank you all very much.